webinars, which means that you'll automatically get a link to the recording and the slides sent out by my colleague Caitlin at the end. So don't worry about notes or anything like that. So yes, tell us who you are, where you're from, and maybe what your interest is in this, maybe what role you are. Are you a learning and development person? Are you a manager or a leader in an organisation? Give us a sense of who's out there listening and whether you're eating your lunch or not. So leading others through change. So those of you, is your first webinar, you may not know me. So my name's Lucinda. My background is many years in corporate learning and development. And I see an old colleague is on here, Steve, welcome. So I'm also a chartered psychologist. I found and CEO of Actus, which I'll mention in a moment, just to give context. I host the HR Uprising podcast, which is where Rachel found me. And also I wrote a book called How to Be a Change Superhero, which I ought to promote, shouldn't I? I should wave it, which is available on all good bookshops. Well, probably not, but certainly it's available on Amazon, and it's also on Audible. So some of the content I'm going to share with you is within the book that's in there. So in terms of just briefly explaining what I do for a day job, I'm CEO of Actus, and also I consult for Actus. And what we provide is a complete performance, talent and learning management suite. Now, you might wonder how change, so I'm not sure about selling them, Steve, but yeah, I can definitely sign one if anyone wants one. So in terms of how change fits in to this is actually if you're ever rolling out any kind of new system, and obviously performance management might be one, or if you're doing something like 360 feedback that we also do, those are the sort of things that often involve culture change. And we often think that rolling out the system itself, you deploy it, everyone's logged in and got it on their laptops. That isn't the same as people engaging and using it. So generally, when we're trying to get a sort of a cultural output from something, and it's very easy for us to sit in a very narrow way. And that's where us knowing how to manage a change, and that's me talking about a system change, but it could be any kind of change. It might be a process change, an office move, it could be redundancies, any kind of change. Those are workplace examples, or even personal change. People respond differently to it. So a lot of the principles are the same. But that's one of the reasons I think why I became very interested in change, is that a lot of the time you invest in a system, but you don't necessarily get the return on investment unless you also manage the cultural change aspect around it. So I'm just going to share the sort of key points I'm going to cover in this while I have a quick look down here. So welcome Carol from the States, who I know. We've got Harriet, welcome, who's an HR generalist, lots of change management experience. So probably lots of stuff that you will know and be familiar to you here. Rachel's an OD manager, West Midlands Fire Service. I bet that's an interesting environment to work in. Anyone else? Don't be shy to tell us who you are and where you're based. Lovely, it's coming through. So what I'm going to cover is why people resist change, or perceived to resist change, the traits of a change superhero, which is the sort of angle that I take in terms of thinking about ourselves as change champions or change leaders, our natural reactions to change, and how we can lead others through change. And what I would definitely say is, if you've got any specific questions as we go through this, I'll try and answer those. So do feel free to share those. Now, while we do this, I'm going to put up a quick poll for us just to get a sense of who we are on this call. Now, most people have a sense of whether they love or hate change. Some people are neutral, but what we're going to do first of all is just get a sense of, are you on this call because actually you quite like change, or are you having to manage change? Let's just a sense of who we are and what our views are. I hope it's not plain rice. Alex is having rice for lunch. I mean, I'm sure that's nice and hopefully warm and soothing in this cold weather we've got. So most of you have had chance. Spice and whisk, and that's exactly what you need today. Let me just have a quick look. Got independent HR director. So Pete, you're managing change, supporting people going through that. Great. Alex, great. Thank you. Long time podcast listener. Really going to be relevant here in terms of this, not just cultural change. More change. I'm sure you're used to change, Steve, in the businesses we've worked in. Okay, so not that surprising. So maybe we've got people on here who, on the majority of you, have said you actually quite like change. So you might be the sort of people that seek out change. That would potentially, those of you who've chosen, love it. A couple of you hate it. Fair play for being open about it. I think if we looked across the normal population, you'd find that there are people who, it's probably a normal distribution curve. So there are a number of people who really feel uncomfortable with change, and as are the people who seek it out. So if you think about personality types, if anyone's ever done Myers-Briggs, there's certain types which are more look favorably towards change or almost seek it out, and some who'd much rather have stability. And that's entirely natural. Not that surprising to me that people in HR, OD roles, or who signed up to a webinar like this, may well be people who are quite interested in change. So that makes sense, doesn't it, that you've got an interest in it and maybe are quite comfortable with it. And the reason that's worthwhile acknowledging is that quite often you're therefore going to naturally respond constructively to a change. When we talk about the change curve later, you're the sort of person who might move through the change curve really quickly, but the thing to bear in mind is that others around you almost certainly don't work at the same pace. It's always realizing that our natural response to change is not necessarily going to be the same as that of other people. So thank you for sharing your views on change yourself. I'm going to start our thoughts about why people resist change in terms of this Peter Senge quote. And it says that people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And that is something I think is always really worth being aware of. Whenever we're rolling out a change or initiating a change, even if it's something that people really can't do anything about, a lot of the initial resistance is about people feeling wedged into a corner, like they have no choice. And that's why communication, which we'll talk about later, is so important in change, helping people to feel like they've got some power, however small it might be, but giving them some sort of insight into it. So even if you love change, those of us who said we love change, we probably don't like things being forced on us. And that is something we have to bear in mind when changes are rolled out in large organizations. It may be that, let's say at the top, the change has been really well communicated, everybody knows all about it, they're really au fait with it and they know why it's happening, but it was completely kept quiet to other people. And that could well mean that they don't, that when the change comes down, they don't know the reason. It's hit them, really out of the blue. So they feel it's being imposed on them. And that's where you get more response and resistance there. So thinking about helping people to buy into change is really key. But focusing on why people do it, they resist change because they feel it's being imposed on them. That's a natural reason too. But then if you think about in-house organizations or change in certain circumstances, why else do people resist change? Well, if you think about it yourself, even if you thought in your personal life, maybe you want to get into a habit of going to the gym regularly or whatever it might be, sometimes we're not motivated enough and we need to have enough to drive us towards it. The sort of things that make people in an organization not feel motivated is that they don't understand or agree with the why. So in terms of a restructure or something like that, people might think that makes no sense. No one's explained the actual why, the bigger picture reason why we need to do this. And sometimes the other thing that happens in large organizational change is the why that is communicated isn't very engaging or motivational to those receiving it. So for example, we might say we need to merge with company XYZ because we need to increase our shareholder value. And the people on the ground really don't care about shareholder value. So they might find that that's entirely unmotivational reason why. Whereas if the reason why was translated into the reason we need to merge with this other company is to create better career paths for our employees, better development opportunities, so that people can build their careers in the business, that's much more likely to be a good why for somebody lower down the organization. So often they don't understand the why, it's not communicated at all, or it's not relevant to that person and it doesn't resonate. Then you've got to think about, is there something in it for people? Trying where possible. If you're asking people to use a new system and they don't have to do it currently, so say a performance management system, and they're currently doing appraisal once a year on a piece of paper and no one can tell if they've done it or not. And they don't really see it as being a really meaningful process. So they currently don't value that process. There's nothing in it for them. If you just sort of say you need to now just do that process on a system, that's not really going to motivate them. They don't really see that there's anything in it for them. And we'll talk later about how you can do more about that. So we've got to think about what's in it for me, that kind of sales, basically change being a change leader is about selling ideas or change to others so they buy into them. The other side of it is that we could tell people to do things, but if we just say, do it this way, and then you walk away, well, nothing is going to happen unless people think there's a consequence to non-action. Now, let's say you're rolling out a new absence management tool. Well, people may not really like an absence management tool. They might prefer the old paper way of doing it. But if it means that they can't have their holiday unless they've completed it there's a negative consequence to that person, then they're going to complete the holiday. They're going to start using the holiday system. So it's about people seeing a consequence to non-action. And if you thought about, I don't know, an appraisal thing again, you could say, will people get access to development? Will they get told off by their line manager? Will they get career opportunities? It's thinking about the things that link to whatever change it is that you're asking them to do. And there needs to be, ideally, thinking about our carrots, which is what my image is here, the carrot and the stick. If you remember, fundamentally, people are motivated towards goals and away from pain. And that's, we all are. Some of us are more goal-oriented, some of us are more away-oriented, but all of us are to some extent motivated by both. So we actually need to think about, is there enough carrot and is there any visible stick? And of course, the status quo, inertia, doing nothing. If you can get away with doing nothing without consequence, then most of us are going to choose that because frankly, it's the easier thing to do. So those are typical reasons why people resist change. And taking those to the next level, you can think about this in terms of the change equation. So this change equation, it's not that simple really, is it? But it's common sense when I explain it. So it starts off by, first of all, being dissatisfied with the status quo. So for people to want to change, we have to create a level of dissatisfaction with how things are currently. The A is the attractive, and then the attractiveness of the future. So I'm creating a dissatisfaction of something, which means I want to move away from that, but also I've got a towards motivation of an attractive future goal. You've then got to factor in whether it's easy for me to do or not. So actually, again, if you think about technology, that's why technology needs to be simple and easy to use. If I have to go through umpteen logins and I can't get on and I can't work out how to use it, that's going to, make me less likely to change. And then thinking about it in relation to how much cost is the personal and financial. Is it easy to do? Does it take a huge amount of effort or pain for me? Is it an financially expensive thing to do? So thinking there in terms of those. So if you want to do change, we have to think about all of those factors in there and potentially create those for people. Now, the image, if you're looking at it, it's a pretty horrible example, but where they've talked about the concept of change is what would make someone jump off a burning bridge, basically, or that sort of thing. You've got to be really dissatisfied with your current position, i.e. it's the oil platform's on fire, to want to jump into the sea, into the North Sea. So all of these things, that would be a very, very strong dissatisfaction, which might overwhelm everything. But in the real world, in the business world, where hopefully we're not in burning oil platforms, it is just about thinking, how can I get people to be dissatisfied enough with what's going on currently, or how can I make the future hugely attractive to people? How can I make this change really, really easy? And the cost there, although it's a financial one, in a business way, it could be, what's the cost of not doing it? Or it could be, what's the value of gaining it? So again, thinking about those benefits I was talking about earlier, is it something that people will gain maybe better recognition from their line manager, or they're going to, if they can demonstrate their high performance, they might benefit from performance related pay. Or if you've got a recognition tool that you want people to use, then they might get recognition credits or whatever it might be. Conversely, they might be singled out by their line manager as being the only person not using a system because they can see it. So that would be a negative cost. Generally, I'd say be positive, but those are just ways in which we can think about applying that change equation to the workplace. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to move on to how we as change agents can do anything. Feel free to drop any questions or comments in there. But that's just to get us thinking about, why is it that people don't change automatically? When you tell them to change, why don't they just do it? Or why don't we just do it? And that's because all of this is in the mix. So if we're trying to influence change, we have to think about these, and we have to make sure that we communicate these. And in order to communicate these, we need to use our change superpowers. So very briefly, I go into a whole section in the book of this. I talk about 5 superpowers of a change superhero. And for me, they are courage, connect with strategy, corroboration, communication, and collaboration. Some of them are more important than others in terms of this influencing to start with. All of them are useful superpowers for us to develop as change superheroes or agents. Now, the first one is about courage. Now, if I was going into that in lots of detail, what we really talk about here is self-awareness. Any of you who've learned about emotional intelligence, is really having the emotional intelligence about your own behavior, and also, for example, awareness about how you feel about a change, but also awareness that not everyone might feel the same way. It's your ability to have empathy with other people's views on change, and for you to tap into where people are responding one way or another and adapt your behavior in order to maybe present a positive that's relevant to that person. So putting yourself in the shoes of somebody else to really understand what it is that they're interested in. So those sort of things, it's about having having the courage to know who you are and being prepared to adapt your style. It's also, one element of courage is being prepared to challenge others. So taking others with you. So you might be influencing a change in an organization, but you're not the senior stakeholder. You might see that a senior stakeholder is not walking their talk, or is actually providing a risk to the project. So you also need to have the courage to go and interact with them, get them on board and challenging them as well. So courage to know yourself and adapt your behavior is the first point. The second point is connecting with strategy. Now, to a large extent, I've mentioned this earlier, which is helping people understand why. In an organization, one of the main things is helping people to really understand what it is that they, where we're going as an organization. This also ties into things like goals, so smart goal setting and things like that to help people be motivated. So where we connect with strategy, the reason for this is to help people say, well, the reason that we are, introducing this new system or carrying out this restructure is because of this bigger why. And this bigger why might be, if we do this, we're going to be bigger, better, and you'll have these amazing benefits. Or if we don't do this, we're going to become irrelevant, or we won't be able to compete in the marketplace. Again, carrot and stick, both are more powerful, but there might be a number of whys, and we need to help people understand those strategic whys as to why we're doing this and how it links strategically, and then to break it down into achievable goals. Going on to corroboration, a good word this, isn't it? It has so seek out, seize. And for me, this is about being credible. So it's not just saying we should do this and, I dream a dream. It's actually about giving evidence as to why we need to do this. So we need to do this, and this is the case. So you might use something like a case study. Company B did this and they got XYZ benefits, or company B didn't do this and they've now gone out of business. So it's about us thinking about how we might influence others and corroborate our need for change. We might say we've benchmarked this, or we've done a pilot of this, and these were the benefits, and this was the feedback. We've done a survey, and people told us that they are so sick of this particular way of doing things, and they want it a different way. So what you're doing there is saying that this is, you told us through the survey that you hate our current approach to whatever process, and therefore we've listened to you and we're doing something different. So you're getting that buy-in, you're connecting with people, but you're providing valid evidence as to why you're doing what you're doing and recommending it. It's not just something you plucked out of the air. And of course, communication. It's all about how we communicate. When we do the communication, it's about listening to people on an individual level where people have concerns, which they will. It's listening to those concerns. It's being prepared to adapt our communication style so it's flexible for different types of people. So you might be talking to trade unions. Well, that's got one style of communication, and then you've got your sort of people who are, let's say new graduate scheme who are excited about everything, or you've got the old cynics, whatever it might be. You may have to adapt your style and your sales pitch dependent on the needs of the people that you're talking to, and whether it's one-to-one or otherwise. The statement at the end is talking about deletion and distortions, which is a bit jargony. So if anyone's heard of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, they sometimes talk about deletion and distortions, which is where when we know something, we sometimes delete key points, or we don't explain things properly because we assume that other people fully understand it. So we need to make sure that we explain the change fully in terms of that. In terms of distortions, that's where people go, oh, everybody says this is a bad idea. It's never going to work, where people have a distorted view of things or they overgeneralize. And when you're trying to make a change, it's quite important to potentially pinpoint those, not let those sort of negative generalizations become out of control. So if they say, oh, everybody, say, okay, so who specifically says that? Who specifically has got a concern? Or it's never going to work. So, oh, has it never worked anywhere before? Or what makes you think that it's never going to work? What are your concerns? So it's important to sort of drill in on those overgeneralization terms and listen to people's concerns and address them. Thank you, Steve. Connect with strategy. It'd be interesting to find out whether that's been done in terms of the change that you're going through at the moment. So collaboration, this for me is key. You can't change, one person cannot make a change at an organizational level. You absolutely can't. You've got to think we. It's got to be a we. It's about a we in terms of come with me. Should we all do this together? About getting other people to join in. Just that general collaborative term. So, okay, I understand that you're not happy with this at the moment. How can we address your concerns? And ideally, you know, that whole sort of ripple effect, getting other people to come with you and building your own change league in terms of other people who are going to go on that journey. And the more you do that, the more you're leading and others will follow. So we have to take people with us. There's a great YouTube clip about the guy being the first follower, which I'm sure some of you could Google that. I'm sure some of you have seen this. There's the guy dancing at a festival, and he just looks like a nutter because he's there on his own. But then a second person comes up who's the first follower, which is almost more brave than anything else. And then before you know it, they've created a movement. It's a great illustration of change. So, you know, as an individual, thinking when you're leading a change, you need to get other people with you. But equally, think about your role when you're part of a change. Could you be the first follower to stand up to help other people be a we? So, you know, that collaboration, that team player. And if you naturally do all of these, I'm going to give you a chance to think about this on a poll in a moment, then that's great, because that means you are going to be a really good person as a change leader or a change support for others. So just for fun, to give me a pause from speaking, hang on a minute, let me just, and that one, that's the same poll of risk release. Let me put out here in terms of our poll. What am I doing wrong? Give you a chance to think about it. So I'm going to ask in a moment, which superpower of the 5 that I just shared with you, and I wonder whether you can, they're all there on the screen, whether you can remember them, is your natural strength? And then which one do you think you need to do more of, or would you like to do more of? Okay, Zoom's changed the way things work. I just had to work out how to do it again. So which change superpower do you already use regularly? Which one do you think you can choose? I think you can choose more than one, but let's say you can a maximum of 3. Okay, great books. 82% participation. Oh, 86, excellent. All right. So, share the results. So number 1, we've got a team of collaborators here. So this way you can share in the chat. You can might find someone else to collaborate with through the chat. Communication. Usually I've got quite a high proportion of HR type people here, which makes sense that would be a natural strength. Connecting with strategy is one, maybe. Let's see whether it would make sense if I put the other one up. Let's see whether that's going to be the area we want to do more of in terms of that. So the top 2, collaboration and communication. Let's try it again. So let's go for this one. Which superpower, and this is, you can choose more than one, but maybe just choose 1 or 2 on this one. Which one do you think you might use consciously that you'd like to develop next time? So which one would you go for that?
Lucinda, it just disappeared from my screen. It could be me. I don't know if everybody else could see it, but it might be worth reading.
No,
try and launch it again.
That's
right.
it.
Try again. I did think everyone had gone from being very engaged to being very quiet. Okay. Almost there. Got a clear winner. 2-horse race just about, but okay. Here we go. So connect with strategy seems to be the one that's, and that's it. They all link together. The thing about connecting with strategy is that once you've got the why, you know, the common strength that people had was communication. So it's having that strategy, but it's then communicating it out. Interesting, a few of you gone for courage. That'd be interesting what you mean there. Is it about challenging others? And then, but not so many have gone corroboration. So maybe you feel you've got that corroboration. Just as a big on this in terms of people on here, this book here, I'm going to do a podcast. I'm interviewing this lady, Carla Miller, this afternoon. This book is really good. And if you're somebody who wants to think about your influence, if courage maybe was one of those things, it's been shortlisted for best business book. I think I would recommend it. No affiliation other than she's going to come on the podcast, but it's got some really good stuff about feeling courageous and feeling confident and influencing upwards, if those are things that you find challenging, because they are key to being able to influence in terms of change. Okay, so keeping moving, I'm now going to share the transition curve. I imagine a number of you have come across this again. Karen, this is the title of the book. Caitlin would put it in, but Caitlin doesn't know. So it's called Closing the Influence Gap. We'll put it on the thing when we go out. On the Carla Miller. Oh, sorry. Closing the Influence Gap. Is it in focus now? So I've hidden my camera. We'll pop it out, the link when we send out the post show notes. I'll pop out the, don't worry, Karen, I'll put it, look out from the email from Caitlin, and I'll put the link on there when it comes out. So the transition curve, this is the natural, the transition curve is basically how we naturally respond to change. Now, this originated by a lady called Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it was linked to bereavement. This is a much simplified version, which kind of works in business, but it's useful if you're a change agent, understanding how people are reacting to change, because if you realize that these are entirely natural responses, then it makes you feel, I guess, more positive about it. So essentially what we're saying, our natural response, and even for the 70 or 80% of people on this call who really love change, is initially to go into denial. Right, so it's something to kind of go, actually, it's not going to happen. It isn't real. And if you think an analogy my colleague used to use was, if you're on the motorway and you're driving up and you see at the top that the motorway says motorway shut at next junction or 5 junctions on, do you immediately get off the motorway? Almost certainly not, do you? You basically go, no, it'll be all right. You go into denial. I'm not getting off. Thank you. Katie's found the book. So the transition curve there. So you've got start with denial, where people go, oh, it's not going to happen. If I ignore it, hopefully it'll go away. So the next one is resistance. Now, the interesting thing about these is which ones you can see and which ones you can't see in terms of them. And actually, it should show on here. It's disappeared off my picture. At the top of this image, it talks about these images at the top. Denial, they're invisible. So denial and commitment you can't see, they're not visible behaviours, whereas the ones at the bottom, they are visible. So people will actually express them and you hear them say these things. So someone in denial, you may not realise they're in denial. It's only when they move into resistance that they start moaning or challenging or saying why something isn't going to work, and it feels hard, that you realise that they're resisting the change. Now, it's easy then to feel, oh, this is really difficult. But of course, when they're in that resistance, the benefit of it is the fact they've moved out of denial. And it's important for us to remember that as change agents. Now, resistance is very much about holding on to the past. When we move over further around change, we're moving into looking to the future. And it's still people asking questions, but they're different types of questions. And I'll give you examples in a moment. And then finally, once we get to commitment, that's where it's invisible, but that person is committed to just doing it. It's just how they work. So let me share with you some examples of the sort of things that might go through people's minds in these examples here. So if we're in, oops, hang on a minute, is that still sharing? Let's bring it back up a minute. So what we've got here are just illustrations of the sort of things that people might say. So if I've got a new software system that we've put in place here, the sort of things that are going through people's heads. So if we imagine these are speech bubbles here, this is what's going on in that person's head. So no one checks if I've logged in anyway, right? So if I keep my head down, they'll move on to the next change and I won't have to do anything. So those are the sort of things that people are going on, but they don't really say anything outwardly. When we go into this section here, then you get more about things where they're people speaking out loud. So, you know, I haven't got time to do this. What's the point of filling these forms in when nothing happens with the data? Things will never happen again. So people get to this almost a state of depressed, depending on what the type of, they don't necessarily get depressed with business change, hopefully not too much, but it is something that you see more of. In terms of people get a bit flat, they kind of go, oh, I suppose I'm going to have to do it. It's kind of acceptance is maybe the way to think about it. Then we go into exploration, and you can just see that the tone of the questions are different. So these ones are, why should I do this? I don't really get it. The ones on the left, why? But on the right, this is more, well, where could I do this? How do I find out more? Could I use it for? Who sees the information? That one's an interesting one because that could go resistance as well. So you get people who are much more in a slightly different zone of things, but they're looking much more to the future. And then they've gone all the way through to commitment where they're actually happy to use something. It's great. I can get my team to manage their performance. It's an essential business tool. This is part of my weekly and monthly habits. So the interesting thing as change agents is to acknowledge, I mean, there's lots of things you can take from this, but the main thing for me is often when people feel like they are being resistant and difficult is to recognize that that's actually a really positive stage. And again, I think about, sorry if anyone's a trade union thing, but anyone's had to interact with trade unions, sometimes they very much feel their job is almost to be resistant, to ask all those questions, the tricky questions. And actually you can, you know, by doing that and by listening to them, you can then really sort of start to win them over, because the key with someone in resistance is to make them feel listened to. So help them to feel that someone actually is listening and to basically respond to their, you don't have to change things in their health, but make them feel heard, and where possible, where there are things you can fix, at least respond to them. Even if you go back and say, I'm afraid we can't do anything about it, but this is why. The fact that you are acknowledging, you know, appearing to take their concerns seriously, it's almost the way in which people process. It's important not to get into an argument or anything at this stage, because what you actually want is that people often will work their way through. It's almost part of their own natural process. Once they've had a good moan about something, they then might go, oh, well, I suppose it's here to stay. Well, if they're in that they've got here, that's going, oh, well, so there's nothing I can do about it, begrudging buy-in. And if they start to even see any kind of positives, then you really feel like you're starting to make it. So you can move through here, and then these are the sort of things that you can do to try and help people through this curve. So if you're at the top in here in terms of denial, you need to be prepared. Now that's just interesting, to basically have the courage to challenge people and set clear expectations. So if you see that people are in denial and you're not sure if they're committed or not, but they're just being really quiet, then be prepared to say, oh, I notice you haven't said anything. So, you know, make sure you feel, you know, get them to challenge and set clear expectations. You know, how do you feel about the change? You're being quite quiet. Is this something you're comfortable about? Almost encourage them to have a moan, however much you don't want to. Then once you have got them into the resistance phase, help them understand why. And as I said earlier on, try and make the why relevant to them. And, you know, if they're feeling pain, empathize, because often there are things that are really rubbish that we have to share with people. And, you know, empathizing that, you know, it is rubbish that they're going to get a new manager and they don't want to, they're just settled in, or the office move, or they're going to have a smaller team, or whatever it might be. There are lots of rubbish things that people, you know, understandably don't feel happy about. Feeling listened to is often all we can do, but that really helps them come to terms with it. Then once they've moved over, as they're asking more sort of future-oriented questions, this is an interesting one. Someone's going through redundancy, let's say. They might start saying, okay, so, well, how much am I going to get? Or what other roles are available to me? Well, those are exploration questions. And then once they've made that commitment, you know, acknowledge, it's probably not so appropriate for a redundancy situation, but, you know, recognize that they're committed to that change and use them to help others come through the change. So it's quite a lot of content on this one. Don't worry, guys, I'm nearly on my final slide. So in terms of 8 steps to leading others through change, these are my top tips. First of all, when you're talking about a change and it's a behavior change, so let's say it is a new system that you're rolling out, you need to be really clear about what's expected. Don't go, here's a new system, feel free to use it. But go, you know, be clear about what's expected to them. You know, this is a system, we expect that you should be logging in 4 times a year, or you need to be capturing a minimum of 3 to 5 objectives here, or, you know, you need to capture anything to do with XYZ process on here, or you need to complete it at this timesheet. You need to complete your timesheet you know, by close of play every single Friday. You need to be very clear about what the expectations are of people. If you're not clear, people will make it up for themselves. And if you think about them being in resistance, then the easy thing to do is they won't do anything. No one told me that I had to complete my timesheet by 5 o'clock every Friday. If you're clear about what's expected, then you can follow up. It's very hard to follow up on something if you haven't told people what's expected in the first place. In fact, that's the major cause of underperformance. So you tell them what's expected. Then, as we've said a number of times, we tell them why it's a good thing. Tell them why we're doing it, and ideally what the benefits are for them. Now, if there are going to be consequences, and often you need to think about what the consequences are, they don't have to be draconian, but be prepared that there will be consequences of non-action. If this is a change, it's not an optional change, it's a new business process, then there are issues if people don't do it. Now, I'm not saying you have to go and communicate that out up front, but if there are people who are not doing it, just make sure that you are following up on them. When you're communicating, communicate positively through multiple channels. Cotter says that you can't over-communicate change. He says you need to communicate change 10 times more than you think you should. So that's quite a leveler, isn't it? Quite an interesting one. And make sure you're engaging other sponsors. I talked about senior managers. Make sure other people who are influential in the organisation are also on message. Listen to and address concerns. We've talked about that already. Reiterate expectations when not everybody's doing it. So you might have told them they need to do their appraisal by the end of June, but it's getting towards the end of June and only 40% of people have done it. Make sure you reiterate and tell people again that that's the deadline. It's not changing. This is going to happen otherwise. When people really are getting on board, recognize those early adopters. Shout and celebrate success publicly. Like 95% of the people in operations have used our new recognition system. So use those, celebrate those. And what that does, particularly at the early stage of rolling out a system, is it shows to everyone else that they're being left behind, that they're the laggards. So if they're sitting in denial or resistance and they realize, uh-oh, everyone else is doing it, and more than that, everyone can see that everyone else is doing it, it's almost like the fact that they're left out becomes a nice, quiet influencer. If they are continuing not to do it, then follow up that non-compliance discreetly. And I'd say maybe in small groups, individually, or through a line manager or senior manager for a specific area in the business, and say, I noticed that only 25% of your area have completed whatever it is or logged into it. What are you going to do about it? Actually, you do realize that you are bottom of the directors table of uptake on this great system. Nothing like a bit of competition that works in terms of that, but it's more about, I'd never name and shame, certainly in an early stage. I wouldn't ever name and shame publicly non-compliance in the early stages of a project. Certainly, I'm not saying you wouldn't make it visible. I'd take that through line managers, but I absolutely would cheer about the people very loudly and publicly about the people who are doing lots. So those are my 8 steps that I think hopefully summarize what we've covered so far. Just in terms of your thoughts here, or any questions that you have, please feel free to use the chat if you've got any questions or thoughts. We'll drop a few more links in that you might find of interest. And just while I do this, as I say, I'll stay on if there's any questions, comments. This is the first change management one. Next one is going to be about planning and managing culture change. So I'll look in on culture specifically there. So if you're wanting to change sort of behaviours, mindsets type stuff, I look at some models of culture, and also sort of a 7-step approach to managing culture change. And then the third one is leading organisational change. That goes into things like the Cotter model in more detail. So it's very much large scale change. So they hang together, or they can be viewed separately. They are all different webinars. So hopefully if you found this one valuable, you might want to sign up to one of those. As ever, we will drop some other tools in here for you. We've got a superhero toolkit that's got free downloads that you can access from the website. We'll put that link on the thing that goes out. I think Katie, that looks like, just putting a link in there. So that my book might be my book. That looks like the Kindle.
Yes.
But we'll links that might be of use to you as well in here. One final poll, if I can get my polls to work. If there is anything that you would like to know more about from us here, let me just think. We do various training. We've got some systems, 360 Now Performance. Any of those things are of interest to you, obviously no obligation. But if you want to indicate there, we'll follow up with you naturally and have a conversation about it, because sometimes it's quite quick if we can just follow up. Okay. Oh, here's Rachel's got a great question here. Let's have a look. Let me just put my final. Thinking about corroboration, if there's little available data, no pilots, no lessons learned, so you're building the plane and flying it on its maiden flight, what would you approach? Yeah, okay, let's think about it. If you've got a context, Rachel, it'd be helpful to have a context, but I'll think about it at the moment. So one of the things I'd say is give evidence for the need of it, I suppose, although it's not necessarily where it's the right answer. Thanks, Steve. Nice to join you. Thank you for joining. So I would think you could, a senior leader career pathway. Okay. So I think probably I would go into the why it's needed and say, you've told us that you want such and such. You could go to things like best practice. Rachel, say, I've been to the CIP's website. I've consulted with people in other organisations. I've spoken to, consultants. You could speak to someone like me or someone else who goes, this is what we do. So you could go out and gather information from other sources and say that, this is what appears to be something that works in other places. So perhaps it's about showing your evidence for one. I guess what I'm not sure is, are you saying, are you trying to demonstrate that there's a need for a senior leader pathway? Or are you trying to demonstrate that whatever you've put in it is right? And that's the thing. The other place I'd point you at, Rachel, is look at some of the work that Rob Briner, B-R-I-N-E-R, does. He talks about evidence-based HR, and there's a model, he posted on it today, I think on LinkedIn. There's 4 bits to it. So you don't have to be, if sometimes there isn't evidence, but you can just use the best evidence. And some of the best evidence is your awareness of your organisation or what people are saying that they need. So, corroboration can be subjective as long as you are being broad enough about the pool of people that you're talking to. You say, I've interviewed all of our senior managers and they've told me that they need this. And they've said this is what they want. So that would be there's a few things there in terms of that. So there's lots of, I'm waffling a bit there, I think, but there's basically external best practice is the way to go. Yeah, subjective is okay, especially if you go and actually say, I've talked to you all, or we've done an internal 360 feedback and we've identified that we've got a real gap in these competency areas. That could be evidence if you did that sort of thing as well, which we need to develop here, or we need to have succession there. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Elise has asked Carol a question, but I'm not sure that Carol, you've got it. Oh, I must have missed something further up. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Implementing new, I don't need to do more. Implementing new HR processes, more buy-in. Yeah. As soon as the managers start complaining, leadership can cancel the program. The only thing I say about that, Carol, is can you inoculate up front and say, you know what will happen with this when you get the leaders to buy in, help the leaders say this is why we're doing it and this is why we're doing it, and we know that it's going to be painful. And one of the worst things you can do if you're trying to do behavior change is to stop partway through. In fact, when we look at the Cotter curve on the third one, lots of people don't believe in change because they know it will go away. That's why people sit in denial, because they think, oh, you know what, they did this last time. If we complain enough, they'll pull it and I won't have to go on it. So you could almost inoculate the senior leaders, say, you do know that this has happened 3 times before, we've pulled it, so we've not demonstrated that we're trustworthy. So what that is going to do is, if we really want to make this change, we have to commit to sticking with it for a minimum of 12, 18 months. So perhaps almost predict that that's going to happen, have it out with them up front so that they can't then knee jerk and do it later. You know, the natural response to this is that people are going to push back, you know, and we'll listen to them, we'll bail, and we lose all our credibility. And it's so much harder. It's much harder to get people to buy in a second and third time. The first time they hear it, but if they've seen something be done and then change and fail, then it loses credibility. So that's what I'd try, Carol, on that one. Okie dokie. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for joining. It's been a really nice interactive group of people. Much appreciated.